Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be doing things a little differently. We're taking a deep dive into the French Revolution,
Ooh la la.
but not the revolution itself. We're going back in time a bit to explore the seeds of the revolution.
So like the prequel.
Exactly. Like, what were the underlying conditions,
Yeah.
the dominoes that had to fall to lead to that monumental event. And our guide for this journey is the Rest is History podcast. They have a fantastic episode about this.
Yeah, they do a great job of like unpacking all these complex factors. It's not just one thing, you know.
Right. It's never just one thing.
Hmm.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. So let's start with the man at the top, King Louis XVI. Now he's often portrayed as kind of a well-meaning but ultimately inept ruler.
Yeah, I mean he wasn't a tyrant in the classic sense. He was actually quite interested in Enlightenment ideas, progress reason, even citizens' rights.
He's ahead of his time in some ways.
In some ways, but he also lacked the decisiveness, the backbone to really implement those ideas effectively.
And it's interesting how the rest is history points out this contrast between his intellectual curiosity and his political ineptitude. He was apparently obsessed with tinkering in his workshop.
Yeah, he loved locks and mechanisms. He would spend hours taking things apart and putting them back together.
It's almost like he was more comfortable with the predictable world of mechanics than with the messy, unpredictable world of politics.
It's a great analogy because, governing a country, especially one on the brink of revolution, is anything but predictable.
Speaking of which, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The financial crisis, France was practically drowning in debt.
Up to their eyeballs, yeah.
And their involvement in the American Revolution certainly didn't help matters.
No, it drained their treasury. And it made things worse? Their tax system was completely outdated.
So they're funding this revolution across the ocean?
Yeah.
And it's backfiring on them financially?
Big time. The nobility and the clergy, the wealthiest segments of society, were exempt from most taxes. So the burden fell squarely on the shoulders of the commoners.
So you have this growing resentment, this sense of unfairness.
Exactly. And it's not just about economics. There's a cultural shift happening as well.
Oh, right. The rise of what they call public opinion.
Yeah, exactly. People are starting to question the old order. They're gathering in coffee houses and salons, debating the issues of the day.
I can just imagine the energy, the buzz in those places.
Oh, absolutely. It was a time of great intellectual ferment. Pamphlets and newspapers are circulating, spreading new and often radical ideas about individual rights and popular sovereignty.
So you have this kind of powder keg of discontent brewing. But was there a specific event that really pushed things closer to the breaking point?
Well, there were several, but one that stands out is what's known as the Day of the Tiles in Grenoble in 1788.
Grenoble doesn't sound like the most revolutionary city.
It might seem like an unlikely place, but it really highlights how quickly things can spiral out of control when those underlying tensions are simmering just below the surface.
So what happened?
Well, it started with protests against new tax reforms
Mhm.
that were seen as unfairly targeting the common people, and the authorities sent in soldiers to quell the unrest.
Which never ends well.
It rarely does. In this case, the soldiers ended up firing on the protesters. They even killed a 12-year-old boy.
Oh God, that's horrifying.
It was, and it ignited a riot. People started tearing tiles off the roofs and hurling them at the soldiers, hence the name Day of the Tiles.
Wow, so this seemingly insignificant city suddenly becomes this symbol of resistance against the monarchy.
It's a microcosm of the larger revolution that's about to unfold. And from this chaos emerges a figure who will play a key role in shaping the early stages of the revolution, Jean-Joseph Mounier.
Tell me about it.
He was a young, ambitious judge from Grenoble, and he saw an opportunity in this disorder. He quickly rose to prominence, became a leader of the local resistance movement, and started articulating demands for political reform.
Like what kind of reforms?
They were calling for free elections, greater representation for the commoners in government, and a single legislative chamber.
Wow, these are some pretty radical ideas for the time.
They were, and Mounier is this fascinating figure, a kind of prototype for the revolutionaries to come. He was idealistic, but also pragmatic. He wanted radical change, but he also wanted to maintain order and stability.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and it's a tension that will run throughout the entire French Revolution.
So we have this growing unrest fueled by economic hardship, political discontent, and events like the Day of the Tiles. It sounds like the monarchy is starting to lose control.
They are, but there's another layer to this crisis that we haven't touched on yet. The role of the parliaments.
Now, these parliaments weren't quite the same as our modern parliaments, were they?
Not at all. They were more like high courts. They had a long history of defending their own power and privileges, often acting as a check on the monarchy.
So they were kind of like the loyal opposition.
In a way. But in the lead up to the revolution, they take on this new role. They start positioning themselves as defenders of the people's liberty.
That's kind of ironic, isn't it? Given that they were defending the very system that was oppressing the common people.
It is. But they were fiercely opposed to the king's attempts to impose new taxes, even though those taxes were desperately needed to address the financial crisis.
So they were playing both sides,
Yeah.
trying to protect their own interests while also appealing to popular sentiment.
Exactly. And it's a strategy that will ultimately backfire. They help to create this climate of resistance, but they're unwilling to embrace the full implications of the revolution that they've helped to unleash.
It sounds like France is caught in this perfect storm of internal and external pressures, all converging at the same time.
Yeah.
You have a weak king, a bankrupt treasury, a rising tide of discontent, and institutions that are more interested in self-preservation than in addressing the root causes of the crisis.
You've got it. And to make matters worse, there's this growing sense of paranoia and intolerance among some of the revolutionaries.
Oh, so even at this early stage, we're seeing the seeds of the darker chapters of the revolution.
Exactly. They start labeling anyone who disagrees with them as traitors, which suggests this dangerous unwillingness to tolerate dissent.
It's a reminder that revolutions, while often fueled by these noble ideals, can also unleash forces that are very difficult to control.
And the French Revolution, for all its lofty rhetoric about liberty and equality, was ultimately a very messy and often violent affair.
So we've set the stage for this monumental historical event. Where do we go from here?
Well, by August of 1788, the situation had reached a breaking point. The French government was officially bankrupt, facing complete financial collapse.
I can't even imagine the pressure Louis XVI must have been under.
He was backed into a corner, faced with no other options. He agreed to convene the Estates General.
The Estates General. Now that's a name that sends chills down my spine.
It's a representative assembly that hadn't met in over 170 years.
Wow, so they're dusting off this ancient, almost mythical institution.
It was a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to try to salvage the situation, but it would ultimately set the stage for the revolution to truly explode.
And that's where we'll pick up the story in our next deep dive. So the Estates General, this ancient, almost mythical assembly, it's about to be resurrected. What must the atmosphere have been like leading up to this event?
I imagine it was a mix of anticipation and anxiety, hope and fear. You know, this was a step into the unknown for France, a nation teetering on the brink.
Yeah, it's like opening a time capsule, right? Dusting off these centuries-old traditions and trying to figure out how they apply to this rapidly changing world.
Exactly. And that's where the problem lay. No one really knew how this Estates General should work in this new context. You know, how would they be elected? Who would get to vote? How much power would they actually have? All of these questions were up for grabs.
So it wasn't just a meeting, it was a power struggle waiting to happen.
Absolutely. And let's not forget, this Estates General was divided into three groups, right? You have the first estate representing the clergy, the second estate representing the nobility, and then you have the third estate.
The infamous third estate representing everyone else. The commoners, the merchants, the peasants, the vast majority of the French population.
The ones who always get the short end of the stick.
Always outnumbered, always underestimated.
But increasingly aware of their own power. You know, the lead up to the Estates General wasn't just about logistics. It was a period of intense debate and pamphleteering. People from all walks of life were writing, arguing, discussing how this assembly should function and what kind of changes it should bring about.
So in a sense, the revolution was already happening, even before the Estates General met.
Precisely. It was happening in the minds of the people, in the coffee houses, in the pamphlets circulating throughout France. The ideas were spreading, taking root, and there was no turning back.
It's incredible how these seemingly abstract ideas can ignite such real-world change.
But we have to remember those ideas were fueled by very real, very tangible grievances.
Right. The Third Estate bore the brunt of the tax burden, while the First and Second Estates enjoyed significant privileges.
Exactly. They were ready for a change, and they saw the Estates General as their chance to make their voices heard, to reshape the very fabric of their society.
But the other two estates, the clergy and the nobility, they weren't just going to roll over and relinquish their power, were they?
Of course not. They had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. They weren't keen on giving up their power or their tax exemptions without a fight.
So how did they try to do that?
Well, for one, they tried to influence the elections for the Estates General. They wanted to make sure they had enough representatives to block any radical reforms.
So kind of rig the system in their favor.
Yeah, essentially. And there were also attempts to limit the power of the Third Estate by arguing that each estate should have one vote rather than each delegate having a vote.
So even if the Third Estate had more representatives, their votes could be effectively canceled out
Yeah.
by the other two estates voting as a bloc.
Exactly. It was a clever way to maintain the illusion of representation while still clinging to power. But the Third Estate wasn't fooled. They saw through this tactic, and they weren't about to let it stand.
This all sounds incredibly tense. Were there any outbreaks of violence during this period?
Oh, yeah. The months leading up to the Estates General were a powder keg of anticipation and anxiety. And there were outbreaks of violence, particularly in rural areas, where peasants were struggling with poverty and hunger.
So it wasn't just about abstract political ideas, it was about basic survival.
Absolutely. For many people, the revolution was about putting food on the table, about having a roof over their heads. The grand ideals of liberty and equality were meaningless if you were starving.
So you have this volatile mix of economic hardship, political upheaval, and simmering resentment. What happens when the Estates General finally convenes?
Well, the stage is set for a showdown. The Estates General met at Versailles in May 1789, but immediately ran into deadlock.
Oh, I bet.
The Third Estate refused to be sidelined. They demanded that all delegates vote as individuals, not as estates. They argued that this was the only way to truly represent the will of the French people.
It's like a scene from a playwright. Each side jockeying for position, each move heightening the tension.
And then, in a dramatic turn of events, the Third Estate takes a bold step. They declare themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the true will of the French people.
Talk about a power move.
It was a revolutionary act, essentially declaring that the old order was finished and a new era had begun. Of course, the king and the other two estates weren't about to accept this quietly.
So how did they respond?
They tried to shut down the National Assembly, literally locking them out of their meeting hall.
Wow.
They hoped that this show of force would break the Third Estate's resolve, but the delegates weren't deterred. They simply found a new meeting place, an indoor tennis court, and continued their work.
The tennis court oath. A pivotal moment in history.
It was a declaration of defiance, a refusal to back down. The delegates took a solemn oath vowing not to disband until they had drafted a new constitution for France. This was a turning point in the revolution. It marked a shift from a struggle for political reform to a fight for a completely new social order.
And of course, this defiance wouldn't go unchallenged. This is just the beginning of a much larger, much more volatile chapter in the story of the French Revolution.
Exactly. The revolution was just getting started. The storming of the Bastille was only weeks away, and the streets of Paris were about to run red with blood. The dominoes were falling faster and faster, and there was no stopping them now.
We left off with the Third Estate, making this really bold move, declaring themselves the National Assembly and essentially throwing down the gauntlet to the king and the whole, established order. What happens next?
Well, as you can imagine, this act of defiance did not sit well with Louis XVI.
I can't imagine it did.
He was really caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, he had all this pressure from the nobility, the clergy, to maintain the existing power structure. But on the other hand, he is confronted with this growing tide of, popular unrest that's threatening to engulf his entire reign.
And the rest is history. Really emphasizes, this sense of Louis XVI as a man out of touch with the times. Like he's almost clinging to a world that's slipping away.
Yeah, it's a really apt observation, I think. He was a product of his upbringing. He was steeped in the traditions and protocols of absolute monarchy. And he genuinely believed in, his divine right to rule. And he just struggled so much to comprehend the depth of anger and resentment that was brewing among his subjects.
And it's not like he was surrounded by advisors who were urging him to adapt to this new reality.
No, not at all. He tended to surround himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to hear. And they just reinforced his belief that, this unrest was just a passing phase. Just a minor inconvenience that could be dealt with through a combination of concessions and force.
But as we know, those concessions came too late, and the use of force backfired spectacular.
Yeah, it really did.
So what were the key catalysts then that transformed this simmering discontent into a full-blown revolution?
Well, there are a number of factors at play, but I would say the most significant was the economic crisis that had been gripping France for years at this point. The country was bankrupt, Food shortages were rampant, unemployment was soaring, and inflation was spiraling out of control.
So it wasn't just about these abstract political ideas. It was about empty stomachs and the very real struggle for survival.
Exactly. When people are hungry and desperate, they're not interested in philosophical debates or, promises of gradual reform. They want action. They want it now.
And that's precisely what they got on July 14, 1789, when a Parisian mob stormed the Bastille.
Ah, yes, the storming of the Bastille. The iconic image of the French Revolution, a symbol of the people's rage and their determination to break free from the shackles of tyranny.
But for those of us who might need a refresher, what exactly was the Bastille and why was it such a significant target?
Well, the Bastille was a royal fortress and prison. It loomed over the city of Paris. It was a symbol of royal authority and oppression. A place where people were imprisoned without trial, often for simply speaking out against the monarchy.
So storming the Bastille wasn't just about capturing a building. It was about striking a blow at the very heart of the monarchy.
Precisely. It was a symbolic act of defiance, a way of saying, we will not be ruled by fear anymore. And of course, it also had a very practical purpose. The mob was looking for weapons and gunpowder to arm themselves for the coming struggle.
It's fascinating to think about how this seemingly spontaneous act of violence actually had much deeper roots in the economic and political turmoil that had been brewing for years.
And that's the nature of revolutions, right? They often erupt suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere. But in reality, they're the culmination of years or even decades of simmering discontent. The dominoes have been falling all along, just waiting for that final push to set them all tumbling down.
And what about the king? How did he react to this dramatic turn of events?
Well, he continued to dither. He vacillated between trying to appease the revolutionaries and trying to crush them. He even tried to flee the country, but was caught and brought back to Paris as a prisoner of his own people.
Oh, wow. It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? A king brought down by his own indecision and inability to adapt to a changing world.
There's definitely a tragic element to Louis XVI's story. He wasn't an evil man, but he was utterly unsuited for the challenges of his time. He just couldn't grasp the magnitude of the crisis or the depth of the people's anger.
So as we wrap up here, what are the key takeaways from all of this?
Yeah.
Why should we care about a revolution that happened centuries ago?
Well, I think there are several important lessons here. I think, firstly, it reminds us that even the most seemingly stable systems can be vulnerable to collapse when their foundations are weak.
Right. It's like a house of cards.
Exactly. And secondly, it highlights the power of ideas to shape history. These Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, they resonated so deeply with the French people, and they were willing to fight and die for them.
And it's a reminder, too, that revolutions are rarely clean or straightforward. They're messy, complex events with both noble aspirations and unintended consequences.
Exactly. The French Revolution, while ultimately successful in overthrowing the monarchy, was a bloody and chaotic affair. It led to years of violence and instability, and, it'd be decades before France found a stable form of government again.
But despite the violence and the turmoil, the French Revolution remains this pivotal event in world history. Its legacy, these ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, they continue to inspire people around the world to this day.
Absolutely. It was a turning point in human history, a moment when the old order was swept away and a new era of democracy and human rights began to dawn.
Well, this deep dive has been an incredible journey through the tumultuous years leading up to the French Revolution. We've seen how a series of seemingly disconnected events, a financial crisis, a controversial trial, a riot in a small town converged to create this perfect storm of revelation.
It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and names. It's a living narrative full of drama, intrigue, and lessons that continue to shape our world.
On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the seeds of the French Revolution. We've seen how seemingly small cracks in the foundation of a society can widen and deepen until the entire structure collapses. It's a cautionary tale, but also a story of hope and resilience. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can triumph.
Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. We hope you'll join us again for our next deep dive into another fascinating chapter of history.